Alireza Firouzja's chess is bursting with creativity, and this game is no different. It really shows the new spirit that he brings to the game, and it has a very nice combination. He lays a nasty trap for his opponent, Rauf Mamedov. This was played in the FIDE Grand Swiss. Firouzja has white, Mamedov has black. Let us jump right in. C4, C5. The symmetrical English is how the position starts. But the position that comes up actually is one that can arise from a Sicilian. Knight f3, g6, obviously playing to control this d4 square with his bishop. e4 is played, gaining space in the center. Knight to c6 and d4 before black can play bishop to g7 and lock down the d4 square. cd4, knight d4. And this position also comes from the accelerated dragon in the Sicilian, and it is known as the Maraxi bind. What Alireza is doing by creating these pawns at c4 and e4 is clamping down on black's natural pawn breaks, which are at d5 and b5. So it's a restraining opening in many ways, and black is going to play on these dark squares that are a little bit vulnerable. Knight to f6 attacks the pawn at e4, knight c3 defends it, and now knight takes d4. Black has less space, and usually the side with less space likes to exchange pieces. That also draws the queen to the d4 square, where it can be attacked more easily by black, d6, bishop e2, and bishop to g7, placing the bishop on the long diagonal and staring at the queen. There's no discovery yet because the bishop is not defended at the moment, but it will be. After castling, now black's king defends the bishop, and there is the possibility of a discovery along the diagonal. So Firouzja just steps out of the way. Queen to d3. Leaves the queen in a nice central square, but away from that bishop's aim. a6, preparing this b5 idea. Again, one of the key pawn breaks black would like to play. And here the most common move is bishop to e3, just playing comfortably in the center, putting some pressure on the b6 square. But as we know, Firouzja likes to do things a little bit differently. And he plays the move bishop to g5, a little more aggressive. Now, the bishop is undefended over here, but it puts pressure on the knight and aims at the e7 pawn, which can be a point of sensitivity for black in these structures. Bishop to e6 is played, attacking c4. b3 defends c4, and now knight to d7. Although it's a novelty in this game because of this position is original, this is a very common idea. The knight usually will like to settle on the c5 square, potentially gaining a tempo against the queen and attacking the e4 pawn. So Firouzja just goes ahead, moves the queen out of the way of the attack of the knight, and also stays defending the knight on c3, which is being attacked by the bishop at g7. Mamedov plays rook to e8. That defends e7, so the queen can move away. And also, if black tries to trade off dark-squared bishops, he can now just play bishop to h8 and not have to worry about the rook on f8 hanging. Rook a to c1 defends the knight and also adds some defense to the c4 pawn, which is a key target for black. Queen to a5 puts pressure on the knight and the pawn at a2. And here Firouzja plays king to h1, which is not an absolutely necessary move at the moment, but it indicates that he wants to play f4 and attack with his e and f pawns. And he wants that king off that dark square diagonal. There are no threats on it yet, but just preemptively get the king off of that dark square and attack by advancing the f pawn. Here his opponent plays f6, an odd move, blocking in the bishop at g7. Computers give a variation that seems fairly obvious probably for a grandmaster, but it's the move b5. That actually works here. It looks like it doesn't, but it does, because after pawn takes, there's the intermezzo rook a to c8, and the knight is attacked 3 times. And after the knight moves to save itself, capture on c1, capture on d5, and pawn takes, and black has a decent position, having gotten in one of those 2 pawn breaks, b7, b5. But f6 does create some strength on the dark squares, particularly e5. The big problem, of course, is it blocks in his bishop at g7, and we'll see how Alireza tries to take advantage of that. First, of course, he has to move his own bishop. It was under attack. Rook a to c8 to put pressure down that c file. And now f4. Firouzja is already threatening to play f5, which could lock in this g7 bishop if that pawn is able to stay on that f5 square. So to prevent that, Mamedov plays bishop to h6 before it can be buried. And it also pins the f-pawn, so it cannot advance right now because the queen would be captured in that case. Firouzja plays knight to d5. Now, that looks like he's hanging this a2 pawn. But if black takes the a2 pawn, after rook a1, queen b2, rook f to b1, you can see the queen is trapped. He can minimize the damage by playing queen to e5 because of the pin, but after pawn takes queen, bishop takes queen, knight takes e3, Firouzja would win a piece. So the a2 pawn cannot be captured. He goes ahead and takes the knight at d5, and pawn takes, the e-pawn takes, opening up pressure down this file, hitting the e7 pawn, and also that e6 square is really vulnerable. That's a real gaping hole in black's position. In fact, he immediately defends it with knight to f8 to keep that square under control. Firouzja here offers the exchange of queens. Computers show that rook c2 is a decent approach, keeping queens on and defending a2. If the queen goes back to d8, then queen to h3, setting up discoveries against the undefended bishop at h6. And if the bishop moves back to g7, then f5 really makes it hard for that bishop to get any activity at all. But the exchange of queens, we see this position, and Firouzja, he has a space advantage and the two bishops. And most top grandmasters, if they can get a space advantage in the two bishops, they tend to be pretty happy. So he was probably happy with this position. Knight to d7, aiming at that c5 square that the knight in these Maroczy-bind positions likes to land on. Rook to e3, aiming at e7. Now a5, trying to work on this queenside structure, maybe create a weakness on c4. Bishop to e1 attacks the pawn, and he could just play b6 and defend it, but instead Mammadov goes ahead and plays a4. Again, trying to weaken this structure. It would be a mistake probably to play b4 here, because then black could play knight to b6, which attacks the c4 pawn twice, and after defending it with rook to c3, then f5, and now this bishop that had no life would go back to g7 and would have a very nice, black would have a very nice position. So he goes ahead and takes the pawn at a4 instead. Rook to a8 attacks the pawn, a5, so the pawn is defended by the bishop at e1. So now bishop to f8. Again, looks quite passive, but what he's doing is making it so this rook at e8 doesn't have to defend e7 anymore and can become more active. The bishop goes to b4, puts some pressure on c5 if the knight were to try to land there. Rook e to c8, attacking the c4 pawn, and a3. Computers actually recommend f5 here, but human beings would probably never play that because that e5 square just looks too good for that knight. Computers are okay doing this sort of thing, but not humans. A3 defends the bishop, kind of keeps things tight on the queen side. B6, liquidating these pawns, but so he can open up the a file to put pressure on a3. He'll have pressure on a3 and c4. At the moment, he's threatening to capture the c4 pawn, so rook to c3 to defend. And now f5, that same idea we saw earlier. Black can play bishop to g7 and get some activity with the minor piece. The rook goes to d1, and now knight to a4. Hitting the rook, but this knight also would love to settle on this c5 square still, so it aims at that square as well. The rook goes to c2, moving away from the threat, but also Alireza can create threats on the king side as well by going rook g1, g4. He can open up the g file, create a weakness on f5. He can get some activity on the other side of the board. So Mammadov puts a stop to that immediately with h5. Who just plays h3, still trying to get g4 in, but then h4 is played, and now he's really clamping down on this g4 pawn push. However, Alireza says, I'm going to go after that h-pawn, which he does, but he also leaves the a3 pawn undefended for the moment, and black's knight can go to the c5 square. So he gets the pawn, but he also gives black some key squares. Knight goes to c5, bishop takes h4, the rook takes on a3, and in fairness to black, he's handled a difficult position fairly well, and the position really is equal, even though white is up a pawn. And in the game, watching the game live as it occurred, I thought that it probably was going to end peacefully, but little did I know. Bishop to f3, king to f7, rook to e1, putting pressure down the half-open e-file, rook to c7, defending this pawn laterally at the e7, bishop g5. The idea, he wants to play h4, h5, and if pawn takes, bishop takes with check, and he's getting activity. Bishop g7, king to h2. He could have played h4 there. That would have been fine also. And bishop to f6, h4. And again, black could take on g5. He'd probably be okay. But he plays a much more aggressive and tricky move. He plays the move knight to d3, hitting that rook on e1. Now, in response to this move, Firouzja lays a very nasty trap. Rook to e6. Now, this doesn't look like that great a move. The threat, of course, is to take on f6, and then when pawn take on d6, and win that key pawn, he'd have a winning endgame in that case. The best move for black was to just take on g5, by the way, and attack c4, and the equality would have remained. But Mammadov plays what I would consider the most natural move on the board, knight to c5. Attacking this rook on e6, so black doesn't have time for bishop takes f6. But what does Firouzja play? See, white doesn't have time for bishop f6. He plays bishop f6 anyway. He takes it anyway, but doesn't that just lose material? Not exactly. If knight takes rook, this is the move I think Grandmaster Mammadov missed. Bishop back to b2, attacking the rook on a3, and this would give white a winning advantage. After the rook moves, pawn takes knight, he would have two bishops for the rook, but in a position where the two bishops would probably just be decisive, and white is winning in this position. So in order to avoid that, black takes on f3, gives up the exchange that way before bishop takes b2 can be played, with the idea that now, once pawn takes rook, then he can take the rook on e6 and be okay. Except Firouzja doesn't take the rook on f3. He plays rook takes e7 check first. Rook e7, bishop takes e7, and now this rook has a decision to make. Black has a decision to make. If he plays king takes e7, obviously you just take the rook. So instead he plays rook takes f4, threatening to take on h4, then g3, then rook to d4, and now we see the real fruit of Firouzja's combination, bishop takes d6. He finally gets that valuable d6 pawn, and that puts him in a very good situation, and he's even threatening to take that knight on c5. The knight goes to d7, bishop to c7, the knight goes to f6, and black has some threats here, actually. He's threatening knight to g4 check, and if king to h3, knight to e3 would hit the rook and the pawn, so he'd get that pawn back and have an equal position after this. And there's also some danger for white. If he played king to g1 here, then rook to d1 check would force king to g2, and then knight to e3 check, and the tables would be turned. It's in fact black that would be winning. So he has to be careful. Firouzja, in response to that, plays bishop to f4. That controls this e3 square. So now these tactics with knight g4, king g1, there's no fork on e3 anymore. So he takes away the real sting of that combination. Knight to g4 is played anyway, but king to h3, the knight, you see, cannot get to e3 to attack these two squares now. Rook to e4, and in this position, after playing rook to e4, black resigned, and the reason is very simple. After d6, rook to e8 to try and stop the pawns, just c5, knight f6, c6, and these two pawns are just far, far too powerful. And Firouzja won a very nice game and laid a very devilish trap. Impressive chess. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.